Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ben Hillman, and I'm the director of the Australian Centre on China and the World. And on behalf of the Centre, the College of Asia and the Pacific, and the ANU, it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this year's China and the World annual lecture. Before we begin tonight's proceedings, let's please acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional country of the Ngunnawal peoples and extend our respect to their elders past and present. I'd also like to welcome all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. It's now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, who's come all the way from San Francisco to be here with us in Canberra. Professor Jean Ooi is the William Haas Professor on Chinese Politics in the Department of Political Science at Stanford University, Senior Fellow in the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford, the founding director of the Stanford China program at the Walter H. Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center, and founding director of the Stanford Center at Peking University. Professor Ooi has for decades been a leading scholar and one of the sharpest observers of political and economic developments in China. Tonight, Professor Ooi will share her latest research on local government debt in China, which has been accumulating for years and skyrocketed during COVID-19. Local governments in China are running out of money. Some are unable to pay wages to their employees. And it remains a wicked problem for policymakers in Beijing and a persistent worry in international financial markets. In her lecture tonight, Professor Ooi will share her insights into the causes of the debt crisis and whether or not the solutions proposed by China's leaders are likely to succeed. Big welcome to you.
Thank you very much, Ben. It's a great honor to be giving this annual lecture, and I thank, including the Vice Chancellor, for the invitation, and it's always wonderful to be here. So tonight, as Ben was saying, talking about local government debt. And first, let me just start out by saying that this debt is quite unusual, in the sense that the big problem is actually debt that's considered hidden. Because if you just look at the official numbers of local government debt, it doesn't look that bad. You would never know there was a crisis. It's the off-the-books borrowing that is the big problem. And the other very unusual thing about this debt is that it's not officially held by local governments. So Beijing is now saying, oh, we're fine. This debt is not local government debt. It belongs to a state-owned enterprise, because this debt is held by a special purpose vehicle called local government financing vehicles. And as Ben said, it has skyrocketed. So let me just give you a few numbers about how big this debt is. Let me just say that it's big enough that it has rattled global financial markets. And this you may find rather amazing, that Beijing central government actually does not know how much hidden local government debt there is. Yes, China, considered one of the most efficient states, they do not know. And so the estimates run anywhere a little over 8 trillion US dollars to more than 9.6 trillion dollars. That's a lot. How much is that? That's like nearly half of China's total GDP in 2021, or about twice the size of Germany's economy, or roughly double the GDP of Japan. And the other thing that is very interesting is that this hidden debt, it's about the same size as the official central and local debt put together. Now, Ben has already hinted a bit about the so what question. The so what is that local governments really are running out of money. A number of cities have reported that services, including things like bus services, have been cut because they just don't have the money to pay the bus drivers. In addition, we have reports that in some cities, the reimbursements for medical costs, they're not being reimbursed to the extent that they have been. And something else that is rather amazing, that now we find out that local governments are actually not paying businesses. In other words, they're owing businesses. They're in arrears to local businesses. And so central government recently says, no, you have to pay these businesses. So this has real impact on citizens, on the economy. Now, the question that I pose is whether we can attribute this cause of local government debt to COVID. And some of you may not know this. All know about the lockdowns and all the testing and such, but you may not know that the cost for all of this testing, the quarantines, the vaccines, all of this treatment, that was borne primarily by local governments. And here I've got some numbers that we collected showing how the costs skyrocketed in China to treat COVID. Now, the reason why this question of, does COVID explain it, is that, well, if it was just COVID, COVID's past. And so maybe the problem can be taken care of more easily. Now, I am going to argue that, in fact, COVID certainly contributed to the problem, but I would say that COVID is not a sufficient explanation. Instead, I'm going to argue, by the way, this is I'm sorry, I should have said this at the beginning. This is a co-authored project with one of my doctoral students, Jason Law, and a professor of public finance at Peking University, Professor Xu Yunxiao. In any case, we've been doing this research, and we're going to argue that state policies during COVID to enforce fiscal discipline and to deleverage the real estate sector actually resulted in the mountains of debt. And so that, in a sense, this is very much an unintended policy-induced byproduct. And so it wasn't just COVID itself. And so the other thing that is important about COVID, though, is that it actually revealed, unmasked, and magnified the an intractable and made intractable an institutional problem that's been around for a long time. So I will show you in a bit that, local government debt China has suffered it from a long time, but it was not a problem. It was manageable. But it was during COVID that will show why there was an interaction of these policies along with COVID that you see an interaction effect that I would argue created a perfect storm. So let me begin by first giving you a bit more information about these things called local government financing vehicles. You probably have seen this abbreviation in news articles, and I must say this was one of the first times I do a research project, and journals, newspapers do the work for me, and they're almost articles every other week. And so let me tell you what they are, and then why this debt is considered, quote, hidden. And the answer to this also sheds light on the question of, should Beijing be surprised by the fact that there is this local government debt, or is this something they should have expected? Let me begin by going back to the genesis of local government debt. Now, to understand this, I think you need to go back to the mid-1990s when China instituted a fiscal reform, a tax sharing system. And this, the point I want to make is that, often you hear that, well, the reason why there's so much local government debt is that local officials just want to get promoted, ramp up the GDP numbers, and it's just wasteful spending, building bridges to nowhere. Yes, there is some of that, but I would argue that that is not a sufficient explanation. Because if you actually look at what the local governments are using the money for that they're borrowing, a lot of it is to pay for basic public expenditures, public goods. And something that just came out, I think was very useful. Because what essentially happened is that the 1994 fiscal reforms left local governments annually with a fiscal gap. In other words, the amount of taxes that were allotted to them were not sufficient to pay the expenditures that they were expected to pay. And an article just came out that said that while the central government collected, the amount that central and local government collected was almost, this half-half. However, the central government only accounted for less than 15% of fiscal spending, with the localities accounting for the remaining 85.3%. So in other words, the localities were given the burden of having to pay for a lot of expenditures, more than just, the COVID cost. That was just, one example. And so the problem is a flawed fiscal system. Now, you might say, okay, this was 1994, but China went on to experience double-digit growth for decades. Why did this whole system work? Well, I would argue that there was actually what I call a grand bargain that was struck between the center and the localities. The vice premier at the time, Zhu Rongji, he came up with this way to have his cake and eat it too. He said to the localities, give me support this new revenue sharing system, give me the taxes, and I will give you the right to engage in new forms of raising revenue, and you get to keep that revenue. And so this was a deal. And he said, not only will I give you the right to do this, but I'm going to give you the tools to do this. The tools included things like the right to establish local state banks, and along with the local state banks were these local government financing vehicles. So what you have then in China, where you have double-digit growth, it was actually debt-fueled growth. Localities were borrowing to grow. They were borrowing to grow and then to repay their debt. And so here is a map that shows you that there was debt everywhere, local government debt everywhere before COVID. And the darker the color, the more debt there is. But amazingly and rather counterintuitively, it actually worked. And so that these local government financing vehicles were created because there was this other little hitch in the laws. The regulations actually prohibited local governments from bank borrowing. Okay? So what do? You've got this situation where you face an annual fiscal gap. You have to borrow, but you're a local government, you can't borrow. Zhu Rongji said, okay, you guys can set up these local government financing vehicles as an institutional middleman, borrow on behalf of local governments, and that is how the local government financing vehicles ended up holding this debt. And so, you have this, and these are these institutional middlemen that are now teetering on bankruptcy, and that is a problem. Now, just to give you some numbers, on the left is based on an article written quite a while ago that shows you the amount of that different provinces relied on land finance. The table on the right is our calculations, and you can see that land finance provided substantial and increasing amounts of revenue to local governments. And this was a major way that local governments could fill this fiscal gap, do their job. Okay, so the point here is this actually, as crazy as it sounds, actually was a feasible strategy if you have strong growth, and China did, and if Beijing basically kept to the grand bargain. So the point here is local government debt was an expected outcome, and the local government debt was actually essentially condoned by the upper levels, by Beijing, and their actions opened the door to this debt. And so this land finance was something that made the whole system work. All right. Now, let me then tell you what happened, what was going on the eve of COVID. By the time you get to the years immediately preceding COVID 2020, you already begin to see that this grand bargain was beginning to fray. That because the central government started getting increasingly nervous about this local government debt. And this started after the global financial crisis. The huge stimulus package released all of these loans out into the economy, which was great. It staved off the meltdown of the economy, but this meant that local governments actually had a huge debt overhang. They had a huge amount of debt, and most of this was short-term debt. In other words, they were going to mature in 3 to 5 years. So starting around 2013, 2012, things were starting to get sort of iffy here. And so the central government, this is surprising, that the central government did their first national audit of local government debt in 2011. Not until 2011. And they didn't know the numbers until 2014. So, again, it's a bit surprising. And so that by 2016, they decided they wanted to start a deleveraging campaign, i.e. try to cut down on risky borrowing, and particularly they're focusing on the real estate market. I'm emphasizing this because this was something that occurred before COVID, because I think you all know that they were going to be a target during COVID. But before COVID, they started. And then in 2019, Beijing, I remember I was in my office in Beijing, and I was reading these articles, and it said, the central government said that local government financing vehicles can go bankrupt. I thought, oh, wow. And I talked to my various colleagues, and they said, yeah, they wanted to send a strong signal. They're not going to come bail them out. And so this was right before COVID, and they started talking about local government debt as gray rhinos. And I will forgive you if you don't know what a gray rhino is. I didn't either. It's something that is big and dangerous, but not necessarily that obvious, maybe because it's gray. In any case, titanic risk. And so they were doing this, but they didn't do anything to address the institutional problems. Okay, so now COVID. What happens with COVID? And here, I want to stress that you should not think of COVID as one thing in China. I think we have this image of COVID in China, either what went on in Wuhan or else the lockdowns. But actually, there was a lot of variation. And we argue that actually we can divide COVID into 3 phases. And it was what happened. It was the interaction between COVID and state actions during the different phases that created the problem. And so let me just move straight on to the first stage. The first stage, I think we all remember, was the outbreak in Wuhan. The initial response was extremely problematic. There was delayed recognition of the problem. But something that we should remember is that once acknowledged, the Beijing quickly mobilized and contained COVID. And the other thing about this is like between December of 2019 and June of 2020. And what is very interesting also is that during this first phase, we see Beijing's actions in sharp contrast to what they were doing before COVID and after June. During this first phase, the central government actually issued 1 trillion yuan of what's called COVID bonds. And so this really helped the economy, help local governments, help local finances. And one of the really interesting things is that aside from places where COVID hit the hardest, our analysis shows that the places that received the most COVID bonds were the ones that had the largest amount of debt. So this was a period when central government was acting kindly toward localities and helping them with their debt problems. The local governments, of course, were stressed. They had deficits. A lot of the small and medium enterprises actually really were hit hard, and a lot of them closed. The government's finances were strapped, but because of things like COVID bonds, they got some help. And something else that I think is important, and actually this is you're gonna see that this is the Beijing's undoing in some ways, is that they were doing so well that there was something called the Nikkei COVID-19 Recovery Index. China was ranked #1. In terms of the case numbers, vaccination rates, mobility and functioning of economic life, China was doing great by the summer of 2020. Now, you can see that these lines show that, the dramatic drop, right, from 2019 to 2020. But look what happens. All the measures, both in terms of tax revenues, and GDP growth, they were all going up. And so that by 2021, you had something like 8% growth. And so this was good for China. And it was this, I highlight this economic growth because what happens in the second stage is crucial. The COVID cases have been contained, and there were only a scattered cases. And the regime actually really was optimistic that they had conquered COVID. Now, I highlight this because this confidence that the COVID situation was under control, I think then led Beijing to resume the campaigns that they started before COVID. Because what did they do? They started cracking down and enforcing the fiscal discipline on key sectors, on deleveraging. And most importantly, they started to institute what are known as the 3 red lines in the real estate sector. And I want to stress that they were a bit cautious because when they first started in August of 2020, it was only a pilot. They only affected, I think, 12 real estate companies. And it was not extended until 2021. But what this meant was that overnight, real estate companies that had been, a great business model, successful business model of borrowing to grow and borrow to grow, that overnight they hit a wall. Those that were too leveraged no longer were able to borrow, period. So that means that if they were not able, if they did not have liquidity, they had no cash, and they could not then repay loans coming due. In addition to the real estate sector, that same year, actually that same summer and fall, they started cracking down on the tech sector. And this included, for example, you might remember, Ant Financial, they were going to have an IPO and they pulled it like the night before. This was during COVID. All of these things I remember, but until I started this project, I never put it together. This was in the middle of a pandemic. And then they moved on to cracking down on the after-school sector, tutoring sector, and the gaming sector. And so again, they were feeling like, they needed to do this. And I have to say that, yes, there was a reason why they should have tried to deleverage the real estate sector. The prices were going up. And they had this idea about common prosperity. Housing is for living, not for speculating, all of these things. And so there was cause, but it was a question of timing. And so in addition to cracking down on business, most of this, by the way, was private business, they also started cracking down on local government debt. And so there were all this series of measures to try to stamp out and resolve local government debt. So basically, they moved from giving the COVID bonds to once again saying, no, you got to have to stop, no more local government debt. And they even instituted something like a traffic signal system where they rated local government financing vehicles to determine if they could issue bonds. And those that were too leveraged, they were given a red, and they were not allowed to issue bonds. And they even tightened control over land revenue. Now, stage 3. This is where what they did in stage 2 backfires, because Omicron arrives in January, actually December of 2019 in some places. I'm sorry, 2021. So Omicron arrives. That's the Omicron variant of COVID, and this is when you start the lockdowns. And so you have the first lockdown in Tianjin, and then in Shenzhen, and the most one of the longest, and the one that had the consequences, and people are still angry to this day about, is in Shanghai. And so what happens? I've already just listed what they did in stage 2. Well, in stage 3, the impact is really felt in local government finances. The revenues take a further hit because of Omicron, because you've closed down the economy. Therefore, no taxes, no business, jobs, all of this. And the cost of the testing, quarantine, vaccines are just keep increasing. Because as I think you all know, Omicron was much more contagious, and they were still trying to use the policies that were actually designed for COVID-19, and it just wasn't working. It kept spreading. And most importantly, for my purposes about local government debt, that traditional sources of funding were diminished as a fallout from the phase 2. So tax revenues were decreased because of the crackdown on the tech sector and all the other sectors and the layoffs that came with that. But most importantly, the land finance, the revenue that local governments got from the real estate sector, that really collapsed. And here, let me just show you a few graphs here. Sorry if those don't read Chinese, but basically you could tell all of the brown, the brown and the yellow, that's all you can tell. The negative, those are drops in land transactions between 20 and 21. So what you see that there were already warning signs in late 21. And you can, from this, that only a few places, such as Beijing, Shanghai, Tianjin, Zhejiang, that they actually showed positive growth. Everybody else is in negative territory. And by the way, it's interesting because by late 21, Beijing realized that maybe they'd gone a little too far. They started pulling back from the 3 red lines, but it was too late. They couldn't, it didn't work. And so here you see what happens to land sales in the first half of 2022. And this nice little graph from the Financial Times, all the stuff in pink. That is what has happened, the sort of negative territory. The drops in income from land sales was crumbling by 2022. And so here are our own calculations. You can see what happens. So prior to up to 2020, aside from 1 year, you have double-digit, increases. And so by 2021, you see it decreasing to only a little over 3%. But by 2022, you have a drop of 23%. So basically, your source of land finance becomes unsustainable. They could no longer use it to repay debt or to actually use it to pay for services. Now, what's even more problematic is what was the state response, the central government response during this third stage. And so here, by this point, real estate sector is collapsing. And so the state tries to further pull back from the 3 red lines. But at the same time, remember that this is the same state during phase 2 that said, okay, you guys got to take care of local government debt. But now these local governments have once again, they've gone from, the gray rhinos to first responders, in the sense that the Beijing is calling upon local governments to save the economy at all costs. So they're telling them to salvage the real estate market and the housing market. They're asking SOEs in the localities to invest in the real estate sector to try to prop up these companies. And most importantly, and when I first read this, I could not believe what I was reading. I was thinking, I must be reading this wrong. They're telling local government financing vehicles to pick up the slack from the developers to prop up the land finance. In other words, go out and buy that land that the real estate sector can't buy anymore and that they don't need. But you're saying, but wait a minute, we have no money. That's right. And so what this means is that local government financing vehicles, you go into more debt to get money to buy the land. I know, it doesn't make sense. But here you can see, this is a chart from Caixin that shows where the local government financing vehicles dominated land purchase. And in our own calculations, we calculated the amount of land that local government financing vehicles purchased before COVID and then the 3 years after. And you can see that, in 2019, they were doing a little bit of this, about 10%. But look what happens by 2022. That local government financing vehicles were purchasing more than half of this residential land. So, and here, I don't know if you can see this, but this is the proportions of residential land purchased by local government financing vehicles by province. And you can see there's tremendous variation. But look at the amount that, places like Jiangsu were buying. And so this was the amount between 2019 to 2022. So, and by the way, I should note that there's always a problem of, do you trust the numbers? Well, this summer, it was announced that, well, some of these land purchases, maybe they didn't make them. And they realized that some of this were, the provinces were actually faking it because they literally had no money, but they knew they were supposed to buy it. So buy this land. So they said, well, we did it, but it then has been revealed that some of them didn't. But this is based on the official numbers. And then finally, I'm almost done, that here we did a calculation of local government official debt and hidden debt between the growth between 2019 and 2022 by province. And here you can see that these numbers are rather astounding. You've got a growth in places like Guangdong of more than 100%. Obviously, that's because their debt was not that much when it started, but over these 3 years, it really grew. And in other places like Jiangsu, the debt is much smaller. The percentage increase was only 40%, but the total hidden debt was 13.3 trillion, which is something like 17% of the national totals. So this was a major hit on, I think, all localities. So to conclude, the reason why I call this a perfect storm is that you have coming together the skyrocketing COVID costs, crackdown on key sectors of the economy during the pandemic that reduces the tax and non-tax revenues, and moreover, you have land finance being turned from a key source of revenue into a source of new debt. And unfortunately, there is no new alternative source of revenue. And I will just end by saying that what is needed is fiscal reform. This local government debt is just untenable.